The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on PCI compliance in the cloud by ControlCase. My name is Kishore Vaswani, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of ControlCase. I really do appreciate your time to attend this useful webinar on cloud compliance and PCI compliance specifically in the cloud today. A few housekeeping items before we get started. If you have any difficulties hearing me, please put them in the chat window. Also, as we go along today, if you have any questions, please put them in the questions window, and we'll make sure we have ample time to answer those questions as we end this webinar. This webinar is expected to run anywhere from 20 to 25 minutes with ample time for questions after the webinar. We will be sending out a recording of these slides as well as a copy of these slides to everybody on this webinar. And also for future webinars, please go to our website to register at www.controlcase.com for our upcoming webinars, especially a new series on GDPR that we will be going through in the next webinar, which is a fairly hot topic now as the GDPR compliance dates come here in the next 3 to 6 months. That being said, thank you once again, and let's get into the meat of the presentation. Our agenda today will, talk about the cloud. In today's world, it's starting to become more and more, cloud is starting to become more and more accepted at a very fast pace. And we'll talk about what we mean by the cloud. We'll talk a little bit about PCI DSS, because we're using PCI DSS as the example for compliance in the cloud, and specifically PCI DSS compliance in the cloud. And then finally, we'll get into the different requirements of PCI DSS and ensure that we talk through them in a little bit more detail. About the cloud, before we get into the cloud, certainly as we talk about the payment landscape, there are various technologies out there. We have mobile payments, we have point-to-point encryption, and really cloud payment providers or use of cloud for payment processing is right in there in terms of a fairly rapidly evolving payment landscape. When we talk about cloud, what is a cloud? We like to classify clouds into different types of infrastructure environments where companies host their systems. You could have a private cloud by a brand name hosting provider, whether it's NCR, Rackspace, IBM, AT&T. These come to mind as fairly large hosting providers who also provide cloud services where you can provide cloud hosting within their environment. Then you have something like Amazon or Microsoft Azure, which is more of a public cloud where it is not being limited to one data center, and it is a much more wide-ranging cloud. And then finally, you have internal cloud, where a company or an enterprise may actually implement virtualization or virtual machines within their environment or within their internal data center and provide a cloud environment to their internal customers. So there's various kinds of clouds that exist out there, and as the landscape evolves, you could potentially have other mixes and matches of these types of clouds as well. The key compliance differences when we talk about a regular traditional in the office or hosted in the data center environment and a version of cloud is, one, the amount of public versus private or public versus private part of the network. Then physical versus logical. A lot of times physical access is irrelevant in case of cloud providers. In many cloud providers, there are unknown physical boundaries. And then access at the base virtualization level, sometimes from a logical and physical perspective, is also known versus unknown. So these are some of the key aspects that affect compliance when you talk about compliance in the cloud in general and PCI compliance in the cloud in specificity. As we get to PCI DSS in the cloud, for those of you who are new, what is PCI DSS? Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard was set in place for ensuring that the payment chain is essentially secure. So anyone who stores, processes, or transmits card data or account data or card account data needs to adhere to this standard that is being managed by the PCI Security Standards Council. How does it apply to the cloud? Because there's a lot of different infrastructures out there, which then gets us to what is our details of our topic today, which is PCI compliance in the cloud. At the simplest level, I call it Compliant Cloud 101. This is how it works. You still, from a PCI perspective, need a DMZ. You need to have an internal network which potentially stores card data or may at least process or transmit. And then you need to separate that by logical access control. And so all of this needs to be there in the cloud in a base 101 environment of a compliant cloud or something or infrastructure hosted in a cloud that is compliant to PCI DSS. The PCI DSS requirements span across 6 high-level areas and 12 sub-requirements. The high-level areas are, number 1, ensuring that the network is secure. As I mentioned, it includes making sure the configurations are good, you have a DMZ, firewalls are being looked at from an appropriate manner. Number 2 is protecting cardholder data, whether it's in storage or transmission, by ensuring it's encrypted. Next is having a vulnerability management program, which includes antivirus and ensuring that the applications don't have vulnerabilities like OWASP and SQL injection and cross-site scripting and so forth. Next is implementing a strong access control, whether it's at the logical or the physical access control layer. Regularly monitoring and testing networks, which is ensuring you're doing penetration tests, vulnerability scans on a quarterly basis, and regularly testing systems and processes. And then ensuring that you have the right information security policies and procedures to address all the different components of PCI DSS. Let's get a little bit more detailed on a requirement by requirement level. Requirement 1, which talks about ensuring you have a DMZ and also talks about secure network and firewalls. Let's talk as we go through our details on, in a cloud environment, what is the cloud provider responsible for and what you as the customer, and by you as the customer, it means you as the customer who wants to get compliant to PCI DSS. If you are a cloud provider, then the first bullet will apply to you, i.e. what would be the responsibility of you as a service provider of the cloud. So when we talk about firewall, the cloud providers must provide ability for DMZ to be created, right? So you should have ability for virtual firewalls, network segmentation, and so forth. It could be in the form of providing network segmentation or having multiple segments that you have already pre-configured from a segmentation perspective and having a separate DMZ and internal network. If you are implementing in a cloud like that, you as the customer who needs to be PCI DSS compliant as well, whether you're a payment provider or a merchant, must ensure that the DMZ has been implemented, because even though the capability may exist, it is your responsibility to ensure you actually implement it correctly. When we talk about configuration standards, the cloud providers need to ensure that secure configurations are implemented for the hypervisors and the base platforms that host the virtual machines. So in all clouds, there's a concept of a hypervisor, which is the infrastructure that hosts the virtualization environment, and then the VMs. And that's kind of consistent no matter which of the configurations you look at. And so cloud providers should ensure that the underlying layer of hypervisors and the supporting infrastructure has secure configurations. Customers who are implementing in that cloud need to be responsible for their own virtual machines and ensure that they are ensuring secure configurations exist there. Requirement number 3, which is ensuring that cardholder data is encrypted. Well, the cloud providers don't have any requirements there. The customers have to ensure their data is encrypted, irrespective of whether it's in their premises or VM, and so there's no cloud coverage there. Same thing for requirement number 4, cardholder data in transmission. That's really an application layer issue, and typically, and there are variants of this, but typically customers would want to make sure their applications and their data using secure encrypted protocols are being used. When you look at it from an anti-malware perspective, the cloud provider must ensure, as I mentioned earlier, that the base platform or the supporting infrastructure have anti-malware installed on their side. So whether it's antivirus or anti-malware, their internal infrastructure that supports the hypervisor needs to be protected against malware. And customers should ensure same on their virtual images or their cloud images have anti-malware installed. And this concept of cloud provider ensuring their infrastructure is secured at the base level and customers ensuring their virtual machines are secure, you will hear that again and again as a theme across this presentation, and that's a key takeaway from this presentation as well. When you talk about secure applications are typically not provided by cloud providers. Sometimes you have application as a service, but by and large, for most of the customers, they are maintaining their own applications, and that really has no difference whether it's in the cloud or somewhere else. When we talk about logical access control, the cloud providers must make sure that people who have access to their base infrastructure and hypervisors have a strong identity and access management scheme in place. And you as the customer are responsible for ensuring that access control within your cloud images are appropriate, i.e. making sure that logical access control to your specific virtual machines are appropriately addressed. From a physical security perspective, most of as against when we talked about application, typically a lot of most of the requirements really turn out to be requirements that the cloud provider has in this case, i.e. the cloud provider typically has to ensure that they are compliant from a physical security perspective. And customers just need to make sure that they select a cloud for implementation. And most clouds today are physically secure. Logging and monitoring. The cloud provider must ensure, again, that their base hypervisors and base infrastructure are appropriately logging and monitoring, as well as the network and security devices that support that infrastructure. The virtual machines are the virtual images of the operating systems and applications really become the responsibility of the customer. So again, similar to before, when we talk about cloud providers, whether it comes out to log management, file integrity monitoring, every hypervisor needs to have logging and file integrity monitoring enabled, and an internal system to ensure that that's happening appropriately. The customer obviously has to make sure that the customer is doing logging of the virtual images of the operating system. Let's talk about vulnerability management, which is requirement 11. And the cloud provider needs to scan their own devices for vulnerabilities and actually perform penetration testing to ensure that customer networks, or virtual customer networks, are segmented appropriately. So here, the cloud provider has to ensure that they don't become the base single point of failure for security, because a breach at the virtual machine, at the hypervisor level, could lead to breaches of multiple customers. And so the cloud provider has to make sure that they are always on top of ensuring that the base platforms and the hypervisors are appropriate when it comes down to ensuring that the vulnerabilities are looked at, they don't affect multiple customers, and that they are fixed on an ongoing basis, without fail. Customers have a big responsibility here too, which is to ensure that they are, looking at their own virtual machines and ensuring that they are scanning their own internal devices on an ongoing basis. For those of you who are familiar with Amazon, a lot of times before you scan your own internal infrastructure, you have to coordinate that with the cloud provider, because the cloud provider might think it's an attack coming in and shut down your machines. And so this is one area where if you are a customer on a cloud, you have to coordinate your internal vulnerability assessments, your internal penetration testing, and all of those aspects much more closely than the other requirements, because you want to ensure that the cloud provider is very well in the loop as you talk about doing scans on your environment. And then finally, requirement number 12, everybody has to ensure that they have appropriate policies and procedures. The cloud provider for their infrastructure, and you as the customer for your infrastructure. So again, just to summarize, I will requirement 1 and 2, both the cloud provider and the customers have their own requirements for the hypervisors versus the virtual machines. Requirements 3 and 4 are really, there's no relevance to whether it's a cloud or not. And then 6 to some degree. Requirement number 5, 7 and 8, again, both cloud and customers have their own aspects. Requirement number 9, physical security is typically a requirement only for the cloud provider, not for the customer. And then all the other 3, again, the shared responsibilities between cloud provider and the customer. So, some key takeaways as you make cloud decisions. Whether you're a small enterprise, a mid-sized enterprise, or a Fortune company, everybody is looking to ensure that some form of virtualization or cloud is used in their environments. We'd be hard-pressed to think of companies that are not doing that. And so, as you as a customer who wants to ensure that you're moving to a cloud that doesn't inhibit you from compliance, or you as a cloud provider who wants to attract customers to ensure that they are compliant, have a couple of key takeaways. Number 1, as a customer, as you're looking for a cloud provider, the simplest way to say is make sure they're PCI certified, and through what we call an attestation of compliance and a report on compliance. But when you're seeing that they're PCI certified, it should not be in the context of them as merchants or taking credit cards. They need to be compliant in the context of infrastructure provider, right? So, it's not about them taking credit cards for their customers that's compliant. It is you hosting your infrastructure as a customer in a cloud that you need to make sure that they are compliant. And then you can look at the matrix of the service provider through report on compliance or the service provider compliance matrix to ensure that all the requirements except 3, 4, and 6, they are compliant to. I.e., they are 3, 4, and 6 is something where they don't. The cloud typically does not have much to do, but the remaining 9 requirements from 1 through 12, the cloud provider must be compliant for you to have comfort that you can host in their cloud or in your own internal cloud and still be compliant to the PCI DSS standard. We certainly have what we call compliance as a service offering. As we get to the end of the presentation, certainly if you have any questions on our compliance as a service, which includes having a cloud, which also includes cloud versus non-cloud environments, certainly feel free to reach out to us. We at ControlCase are basically focusing on compliance as a service as well as certifying companies to one or multiple standards on an ongoing basis. Feel free to reach out to us through our website or any of these phone numbers if you have any questions. At this point, we will open up this for any questions. I see there are a few questions there which we will answer. And as you know, as we go through it, if you have other questions, just please feel free to go ahead and ask questions. The first question is, will these slides and a webinar be made available? And the answer is yes, we will be making this available for download. The next question is that you were not able to see the requirement number 12. Can you show it again? Absolutely. So the requirement number 12 really is focused on policies and procedures, and we will be sending out a copy of these slides to everybody. But requirement number 12 for policies and procedures basically ensures that the cloud provider has policies and procedures to maintain their base infrastructure, and you as the customer also have the policies and procedures to ensure your virtual images are looked at in an appropriate manner. The next question is, if all the data is encrypted prior to being sent to the cloud, does it reduce the burden on the cloud provider? And the answer is absolutely yes. If it's data using strong encryption techniques that is being encrypted before it's ever being sent out of a customer's environment, that definitely reduces the burden. Many requirements probably won't apply, like vulnerability management and so forth. Certainly some of the encryption controls would still apply to you as the customer, but it certainly reduces the burden. And the same is true for backups, right? If you do a backup and do an electronic backup and encrypt it before sending it out, it greatly reduces the burden. So that's definitely a good practice. The next question is, how often are vulnerability scans and pen testing required by PCI compliance? So with the new versions coming out, it depends on whether you're a service provider or a merchant to some degree. At the base level, vulnerability scans are always required quarterly and at the minimum. So vulnerability scans, whether it's internal or external, are always required quarterly. A penetration test, if you're a service provider, especially the segmentation pen test, is required starting shortly every 6 months. Otherwise, the penetration test is required, the regular one, once a year. Both scans and tests are required after a major change. And then for companies that fall into a special category because they are major consolidators of data, their acquirers may ask them to do it more frequently. So depending on the test, at least quarterly for vulnerability scans, at least maybe annually or semi-annually for penetration tests, and anything could be more frequent if the acquirer has asked companies to do that. All right. Well, those were all the questions. I really do appreciate the time that you have taken to attend this webinar. We will be sending out a copy of this webinar and slides. Again, don't forget to register for our webinar on GDPR as well as PCI version 3.2, especially with some of the new changes coming up on our website. And we look forward to speaking to you on the next webinar. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.